Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Last week we troubleshot the first half a dozen texts of the 5th chapter of the Gita, where sannyas and yoga were compared and contrasted. And Krishna seemed to be a bit equivocal, on one hand criticizing sannyas, renunciation, and on the other hand endorsing it. So we looked at some ideas around that and some of the problems with various reconciliations, and at the end we weighed in and point out the difference between Sankhya and sannyas, and that resolved the problem. There's another much more difficult reconciliation that's about looking at how there may be some limited scope for sannyas, and that there are verses and chapters in the Gita which do sometimes speak favorably about renouncing the world. And in that case, it becomes problematic because Arjuna was told categorically that no, you shouldn't run away from your duty, but it may be that somebody's duty at some point, usually towards the end of life, it might consist of renouncing the world. And that'll come up again in the 6th chapter, and we'll deal with it more thoroughly there. But that's just a recap of what we've done so far. And so now we're up to text 7. I think we'll go ahead and translate this verse real literally. So just go ahead and open your books up. We'll look at text 7 together. Chapter 5, text 7. Yoga yukta. Yoga yukta. One who is yogad to yoga. Yukta is the past participle of the verbal root yuj, and it means, for all intents and purposes, it means yoked. It actually sounds like yoked. But if you want to get real literal, it would be yogad. So, tied to, united with, bound to. Yoga yukta. Yogad to yoga. You follow? Yukta being the past participle, it means, it's like saying yogad. Yogad to yoga. And this compound occurs all over the place in the Gita. And this would be what's called a bahuvrihi samas. They have different Sanskrit compounds, and in Sanskrit, unlike many other languages, you will have these compound words. A compound word is like do not becomes don't. Okay, like you take two words, you put them together. Now in Sanskrit, that it becomes a whole thing. It becomes a whole thing. And you can unite words in a variety of ways. And so there's dvandva, which means both words have equal value. So you can say Rama Krishnau, which means Rama, which is Balaram, and Krishna. And by saying Krishnau, you conjugate, or decline, the noun Krishna in a dual case, which means these two entities. So they're equally weighted. It's called dvandva. It's where you get the word duo from. It's from dvi in Sanskrit, means two. Both words are equally weighted. So in a Sanskrit compound, you'll take two words, and you will put them together, but you will only modify the final word, but it's meant to modify all the words. For instance, you have the term, let me give you another example. The red coats are coming. When you hear the red coats are coming, if you're born in this country, you don't think, or anywhere actually in like the Western world, you don't think that a bunch of red coats on like a rolling rack are rolling down the mountain at you. You think a bunch of soldiers in red coats are coming, or skins and shirts are playing. You don't think a bunch of like human skins are like sitting on a basketball court somewhere. You think that a bunch of people with their shirts off and a bunch of people with their shirts on are playing. So this is called a bahuvrihi samas. That's what's used here. It's when you're referring to the person who possesses that quality. So one who is yoga yukta, a person who is yoga yukta. Vishuddhatma, it's another bahuvrihi samas. Vishuddha means pure, shuddha means pure, vishuddha means super pure. Atma, their self, is very pure. So one who is yokta yoga, one who is a pure soul. Vijitatma, one who has conquered themselves. Atma here means self, oneself. It doesn't just mean soul, it also means oneself. Vijitatma, one who's conquered themselves. So vijita means conquered, from jit, which means to conquer. So vijitatma, this is a soul who's conquered themselves, one who's conquered themselves. Jitendriya. Jitendriya is another compound. It means one who has controlled their senses. One who's conquered their senses. One who's controlled themselves, conquered themselves. One who's conquered their senses. One who's a pure soul. One who's yoked to yoga. These are 4 different compounds. Like saying the red coats, the blue coats, the green coats, and the yellow jackets, referring to like 4 different types of people. You follow? It's called a bahuvrihi samas. Then sometimes you've got what's called a karma dharaya samas. It's where the first word is an adjective and the second word is the primary thing. So, for instance, you could say Pitambar is a name for Krishna. Pitambar. Pitambar is a karma dharaya samas. It means yellow dress, because it just means pita means yellow and ambar means dress. Pitambar, you put it together. Then you wouldn't conjugate, or you wouldn't decline the word pita, yellow. You only decline the final syllable, and then the whole thing is conjugated or declined. I realize I'm getting out of your depth. Just my old buddy walked in, the linguist, and so now I'm doing a little linguistics for him. If I was to say Pit Ambar, it means yellow dress. But it also means the one who wears a yellow dress. And you get to choose as the reader whether you look at a compound as being the first word is an adjective modifying the second word, or if it's referring to a person who has this quality. Does that make sense? So red coat could be a red coat, right? Which coat should I wear? Wear the red coat. The red coats are coming. One of them means the people who are wearing red coats are coming. The other one means it's a coat which is red. When you look at language, when you look at Sanskrit, you get to decide which type of compound you're dealing with. And sometimes Sanskrit poets will take a term and you could do either one with it and it still works and it still makes sense. You know, whenever I hear rhyming English poetry, I always think of limericks, you know? You follow? It's just like somehow or other rhyming English poetry is ruined for me for all times because of limericks. I can't even think of a limerick. I'm like traumatized from limericks. It was like, there once was a girl named Jude. She was a bit of a prude. You know, it's like that, right? It's like that kind of, like sort of like an Irish, you know, limerick. It's like some kind of bar poetry. Right? You know what I'm talking about? So rhyming poetry just doesn't do it for me. Sanskrit poetry does do it for me. And they do cool stuff. They'll repeat syllables. They don't really do exact rhyming poetry, but they'll have a certain amount of syllables per line. And they'll have a certain cadence that you chant those at. and then they'll also have repeated letters in different lines, which shows alliteration without compromising the meaning. And then they'll also take words and they'll give double, triple, quadruple meanings to them so they can be read in different ways, and one verse becomes almost like a holographic image where it becomes a completely other verse if you read it differently. And there's a whole genre of literature called the champu genre that our poets wrote in, and every single verse has a double meaning. An entire book, and every single verse has a double meaning. Can you even fathom such a thing? So the level of sophistication that would be required to do something like that. So there's whole books, there's a whole genre of literature like that. So yoga yukto, the one who is yoked to yoga. Vishuddhatma, the one who has a pure soul. Vijitatma, the one who's conquered themselves. Jitendriyaha, the one whose senses are conquered. That's interesting. What does it mean to be Vijitatma, to conquer yourself versus conquering your senses, right? That you got to think about that one, right? Is Krishna being redundant for dramatic effect, or is he making two separate points? You get to choose as a commentator how you want to take that. You could take, because it says Vijitatma, Vijitendriya, or Jitendriya. It's the same meaning. It just makes it more intense. But Vijitatma, V means especially, Jit means controlled, Atma, the self who's controlled, versus Jitendriya. Endriya means senses. Jitendriya, one whose senses are conquered. If you're not going to control your senses, what does it mean to be self-controlled, if not to control your senses? You understand? So you could say, okay, Vijitatma means one whose mind is controlled. You could also say the mind is the sixth sense. Therefore, saying you've controlled your senses already means you've controlled your mind. You follow? Then you could say, no, Vijitatma is just redundant. You could say Vijitatma means a complete control of the self, whereas Jitendriya means you also control your senses, and therefore one is included within the other one, or the other one is stated just for the purpose of thoroughness, or it's a redundancy which is intended to like make the point more powerful, or it's referring to the mind versus the senses, or the body versus the senses, or the soul versus the mind and senses. You've conquered yourself versus your mind and senses. You've conquered your intelligence, because the intelligence is differently conceived of than the mind. See, the mind is the sixth sense. The intelligence is still considered to be separate from that. You have like a huge landscape that is appropriate, that you get to do when you're looking at these verses of what would be a viable interpretation. Sarva bhutatma bhutatma. This is an interesting compound. One whose self is one who considers bhuta means being, like a living being. So the word bhuta comes from bhu in Sanskrit, which means to be. And so bhuta is something which has the quality of beingness, therefore a living being. So bhutatma, one's being, sarva bhuta, is like all beings. Therefore a person who considers themselves to be like all beings, I think the cleanest interpretation would be somebody who's following the categorical imperative of doing unto others as you have done unto yourself. Loving your neighbors yourself. It's a fancy way of saying that. One for whom their self is all selves. Prabhupada translates it as one who has compassion for all living entities, meaning that he thinks empathetically about all other living entities by comparing them to himself. Empathy, you got pity. What's pity?
Feeling bad for
I pity the fool. You guys know that? That was Mr. T. He was a black, muscle-bound actor who wore a lot of gold chains in the 80s on a movie called The A-Team, on a TV show called The A-Team. And he was also, I met him one time, and he was also in the Rocky 3, maybe? He was in Rocky 3, yeah. So his famous line was, I pity the fool. I pity the fool who crosses me. I pity the fool who speaks my name in vain. I pity the fool who says my name without respect. That was his fun line. Now he's an old man. He's like all skinny. Now he's pitiable himself. Age took away all his muscle, and he's like a little tiny guy now. What is pity? You feel sorry, right? Yeah? You feel bad for somebody, but not too much. Not enough to necessarily do anything about it. That's correct. That's pity. These words get defined variously by different psychologists, but the definition I'm giving you guys is the standard definition. It's the most prevalent definition. So that's pity. Then you have sympathy. What's sympathy? What does sim mean? With. What does pathos? Feel. To feel with somebody. Sympathy means that instead of just feeling bad for somebody in a very detached way, you actually feel with them. And therefore, if they're experiencing joy, you feel joy. If they're experiencing sorrow, you feel some sorrow. Sympathy usually motivates some action. Why? Because sympathy, you're starting to actually feel for the person a little bit. Sympathy is usually contrasted to empathy. Empathy. The word's only been around for 100 years in the English language. And so empathy means to feel into someone, to put yourself in their shoes. Now, it may have been, for much of recorded history, that sympathy had a dual meaning. And sympathy referred to both sympathy and empathy. In fact, we find even in this day and age, most people do not know the difference between these two words. And therefore, they will use sympathy and empathy interchangeably. If you want to get really into it, then you can study the meaning of these words, and you can find out that the etymological difference, feeling with somebody versus feeling into somebody, putting yourself in their shoes versus just feeling their pain along with them. Now, if you feel empathy for somebody, you're able to put yourself in their shoes. But that does lead to an interesting question. Could you feel empathetic without feeling sympathetic? Most psychologists would say yes. A sociopath, a highly intelligent sociopath, could empathize with somebody and then use it to exploit them. A con man, for instance, could empathize with his victims in order to figure out how to exploit them. Like you have the classic advance fee scam. You guys know what the advance fee scam is? It's got a bunch of variations. The black money version, the Spanish prisoner, the Nigerian prince. There's a bunch of variations of this. It's an advance fee. There's a bunch of money out there, and I'll give you a share of it, but I need a little bit of money from you right now to unlock that money that's either in another country or with somebody or this or that. And once we free that money up, then you'll get a share of that money, which is much bigger than the money you need to advance me. Advance fee scam. People get big eyes thinking about the share that they're going to get. And so there's a Nigerian prince version of this, which we've all gotten emails about. Hello, I am from Nigeria. I am a prince. I have $100 million, which is just a ridiculous number. I don't even know what that equates to. $100 million, $1 billion. I have $100 million, and so I will give you $1 million if you send me $5,000. Then I will get the $1 billion, and I will give you $1 million. You're like, no, I want $10 million. He's like, okay, twist my arm, I'll give you $10 million, but you have to send me $7,000. Okay. Only 6% of those scams originate in Nigeria. The vast majority of them originate in the U.S. But somehow that was because it's far away. It's like Western Union me the money. It makes sense, right? So, the advance fee scam. So a con artist could, I don't want to be matriarchal, and a misandrist. A con person could empathize with a victim in order to understand them so they could exploit them and get their needs met. You follow? I got one friend, he got scammed out of some money, and then the person who scammed him wrote him a letter and was like, I scammed you out of this money, but now I'm broke and destitute. Please send me some more money. He sent him some more money. Like, such a compassionate person, you know? Naively compassionate. Obviously, the guy was probably going out and buying whatever, just, you know, living the life of Riley on somebody else's dime. So empathy, you could theoretically be empathetic without being sympathetic. That would be a clever sociopath. Alternatively, you could be sympathetic but not really know what to do to help the person because you're not evolved enough to be able to empathize with them to figure out how to help them. And whereas you pity somebody, you feel something, but not enough to really like make a difference. How many times do you walk by, there's a bird struggling or something like that, and you're just like, oh, it sucks. You drive by, you see a carcass on the side of the road or something, and you feel a little bad, but not enough to really stop your life and make a move. And then you have compassion. Compassion. Calm, which means with again, and passion, again, feeling, suffering. Really, passion means to suffer. The word passion in English comes from Jesus and his suffering on the cross. Passion, which I'm assuming comes from Greek, or at least Latin, the Vulgate, for sure. It comes from Latin, which is the parent of all the Romance languages. And so passion. And that word entered the English language to refer to Christ's suffering on the cross. There's Mel Gibson, the psycho, bigot, racist, excellent filmmaker, made a movie maybe a decade and a half, 2 decades ago called The Passion, which is the appropriate term. It's the correct term used by Catholics to refer to the crucifixion. That's where the word compassion comes from. Compassion, to suffer with. Now really, pathos means feeling, but it also means suffering. That's why you have pathology. And so pathos also means suffering. And so compassion literally means almost exactly the same thing as sympathy. But it doesn't in the way it's used. Usually compassion is all of the energy of sympathy with all of the understanding of empathy. And usually with a dose of detachment, because they find when people they feel too much with you, then they lack objectivity, they can't help you extricate yourself from your problem, and they burn out and they can't sustain themselves. So detached compassion is better than attached compassion, because you can actually last longer and do more. This is how the terms are used. But that's the prevailing usage. And I can give you the etymology of the terms, and we can discuss it. But if I was to read a piece of literature, or if I was to have a conversation with somebody, I might interchange these words and use them in a variety of different ways, and I would depend on the context to convey my meaning. I may confuse people. If people are listening to me, they might think I meant one thing, and I have to clarify and say, no, I meant something else. If I write a book and I use this language, but I'm not using it in a really rigorous sense, and I don't define all of my terms at the outset of my book, and I don't follow my own rules, and I just flow, people are sitting around 100 years from now, they could try to get to the bottom of what I meant. The rules of how you determine what somebody meant are called hermeneutics. It's how you look at something and look at a piece of literature and you try to determine its meaning. That's the rules you follow in determining meaning. From Hermes, the messenger of the gods in ancient Greek mythology, who carried their meaning. And so hermeneutics is the art and science of how to interpret a text. And it uses all sorts of things. The etymology of terms, their colloquial usage, how the terms are used nowadays, how they were used at that time. Like the usage of a word nowadays may be different than the usage of the word a while ago. Like ravish. Ravish used to mean rape. And rape used to mean ravish. And they got swapped out. Now ravish is a good thing. And rape is a bad thing. But there was a time where ravish could also be a violent sexual offense, and rape could just be good old-fashioned seduction. And so you have to look at the current usage, but you also have to look at the usage at that time. You have to look at the context, you have to look at the grammar, and all these things come together and you analyze meaning. So even with terms like empathy and sympathy and pity, you follow? These terms are all used variously and interchangeably with really subtle shades of nuance. And you have to be educated to know the differences, and even more educated to use the words appropriately in your speech in real time. It's one thing to be able to use them properly when you write. It's another thing to be able to speak them properly or write stream of consciousness and use the words properly. Welcome to like a serious look at language. And so you have all of these compounds, and you get to decide how you want to take them. If I had to take them, sarva bhuta, sarva bhutatma, bhutatma. My being is everyone's being. That means I feel sympathy, empathy, compassion for other people. You follow? Vijitatma, oneself is controlled. Jitendriya, and the senses. So oneself is controlled. I'd usually consider that to be a more comprehensive category, your whole self versus just your senses. Or it could be, I think contextually, it could be your mind and your intelligence and your soul versus your senses and your body. Controlling your body is really synonymous with controlling your senses. So it would be like a higher level and a lower level of control. Vishuddhatma, your self is pure. It's fairly self-explanatory. It means, purity of purpose. It could also mean purity of like physical purity, like ritual purity, like you're clean. Shuddha is a synonym for shocha, which means cleanliness. Shuddha carries with it more a term of like internal cleanliness, internal purity. But oftentimes in a language there may be no clean word. Like they were translating, Prabhupada used to like to say purity is the force. And one of his disciples brought him a Chinese scroll with purity is the force translated into Chinese. And they were looking at it saying, it's not the best translation. It says cleanliness is the force. Because obviously purity, pure salt. You know what I mean? And so purity, I don't even know if they have a word in Chinese for what we mean when we say purity. I'm assuming they would. But somehow or other, the translator who translated this for Prabhupada as a gift, he couldn't come up with a better term, and so he translated cleanliness as the force. So Vishuddhatma could mean clean, but the verse is heavy, it's deep. So it would be a red herring if you were to say, and you're clean too. It's like, and you brush your teeth. It wouldn't make sense. It's a heavy verse, it's deep. So you are yoga yukta, you're yoked to yoga. It means you're situated in yoga. It means you're connected to a higher purpose. Ultimately to God, but in this case a higher purpose because we haven't introduced a bhakti connection to God quite yet explicitly. And your Vishuddhatma, your self is pure. Your heart is cleansed, I think would probably be the cleanest one. And then Vijitatma, you controlled your mind and intelligence. And then Jitendriya, you controlled your body and your senses. Sarva bhutatma bhutatma, and you consider yourself one for whom the self is all selves. One for whom one being is all beings. The way you would treat one person is the way you would treat somebody else. In ethics, they call this, Immanuel Kant spoke about this formally. He wrote about the categorical imperative, which was a fancy version of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But he talked about a principle of universality. That if you think it's okay to own slaves, then you'd have to be okay with you being a slave too. They also sometimes call it reversibility. So one is like, if it's okay for you to be a thief, for me to be a thief, then it should be okay for everybody to be a thief. The other one is reversibility. If I'm okay stealing from you, then I have to be okay with you stealing from me. And it's a way of subjecting yourself and regulating yourself a bit in your ethical theory by putting the shoe on the other foot and thinking about things in broader terms because you're going to be biased. Does that make sense? Generally, deontology, which is the duty-based ethic, do the right thing, regardless of the consequences, they don't have this fault. They end up lacking nuance, not being flexible. But where you find this becomes a problem is in consequentialism, or consequentialist positions, where you have a results-based ethic, and you say the ends justifies the means. Then you have to make sure that you be okay if the ends justify the means and you are on the receiving end. Reversibility, universality. It's a test you subject it to make sure that you're staying good. You follow? With a virtue-based ethic, which has more flexibility than a rule-based ethic, because it's based on virtue, which can then adjust with the times, then usually you would ask yourself something like, would you be proud if what you did was known publicly? Do you think that your loved one who you respect would be proud of you for behaving the way you did? And these are ways of subjecting your virtue to a little bit of a test to make sure it's actual virtue and you're not becoming biased. So anyway, one for whom oneself is equivalent to all beings. Does that make sense? Kurvan api na lipyate. Although acting, although doing things, na lipyate, he is not smeared. He's not sullied. She's not sullied. Although acting, it comes from the root kri, which is where you get the word karma from. Kurvan. It's in a verb. It's a verb. Although acting, na lipyate. He's not smeared. He's not contaminated. Api means although. It means a lot of things, but here it means although. So, one who's yoked to yoga, one whose self is pure, one who has conquered themselves, and one who's conquered their body, one who treats one person as if he was all people and is truly compassionate. Although acting, that person is not tainted. That's literally what the verse says. And it uses all these compounds. And you get to then decide what exactly the compound is communicating. I gave you what I think is a fairly conservative, literalist interpretation. I'm not taking any flights of fancy. But it's up to a translator now. Because some of these words could be redundant. Some of the words could have, you have to decide where to draw that line to bring the verse to life. Do you guys follow this? And I tried to help you understand what we're doing here by giving you an introduction to pity, sympathy, compassion, and empathy, and how most of us just use those words interchangeably. I thought it was funny how, somebody will say, like, I'm an empath, which is from a 1956 sci-fi book. And it then got popularized in a 1968 episode of Star Trek, When people say to you that they're an empath, they're quoting Star Trek. There was a woman who could absorb your wounds, and the episode was called The Empath. And so like she would absorb people's wounds, and then they would come back. You saw it?
Yeah, I'm attracted.
You're attracted to being an empath?
No, I'm a Trekkie.
Oh, you're a Trekkie. Okay. I thought you said I'm attracted to that, and I was like, oh no, I lost another one. You're a Trekkie, okay. So they took it from a book that was printed 12 years earlier by a Scottish sci-fi author from 1956, but then they popularized it in this 1968 episode, and then a bunch of, kombucha-loving hippies made it into like a personality type. And now like I'm an empath. And it's funny, somebody's telling me this, it's so funny how people say I'm an empath, which means I'm like this incredibly like feeling being who just soaks in everything. But people use that essentially to distance themselves from you and like keep you away from them. So like, whoa, I can't talk to you about your problems. I'm an empath. Like I'll feel that too much. Like get away from me. And so like really they become just like almost like a flamboyant narcissist. Like I have absolutely no room whatsoever for entertaining any of your bullshit because my reality is so deep and profound and I'm such a sponge that I can't even touch you. Get back. You follow? Get back, Loretta. You guys get that reference? It's a Beatles song. So, anyway. So we use these terms in just any number of ways. There can be any number of different things. And when somebody's talking to us, they got to figure out what we're intending. I hate it when I'm like gutting myself to somebody and they're like, I understand. I'm always like, really? I mean, I generally don't gut myself to people I don't have faith in. And so generally speaking, my gurus don't say I understand. They demonstrate they've understood. And then they speak to me. But I have had experience where I'm trying to explain something to somebody and they're like, oh, I understand. I'm like, really? What do you understand? Tell me what I'm saying. And then they just something about something, and I'm just like, yeah, exactly. That's what you understand. Like a whole lot of nothing. And if you want to really understand somebody, you got to not be afraid to ask questions. Engage in some empathetic listening where you reframe what they've said back to them and give them a chance to clarify what they were really intending. And it's a process. Because it's not so simple that if somebody says something, then that's automatically what's intended. The NLP people try to say like 70 or 80% of communication is nonverbal, it's tonal or based on your gesticulations. There's no evidence to support that. They haven't done any kind of rigorous studies that have been vetted or repeated. It's a poorly studied field, but they certainly say it. And for sure, tone is significant. Because text messages are notoriously terrible ways of communicating deeply with somebody. I have a student who just loves to text me really heavy stuff and then get all upset at me when I don't respond appropriately. But how am I supposed to even know what she said? Madhuri. It's a different Madhuri. No, it's not. How am I supposed to even know what she said? Because she texts me. And then, so I text back because I don't want to be a jerk, so I write something. So she'll write me a sentence, and I'll write back like 3 sentences, and she'll get angry at me for writing back so little and not understanding her. But it's like I'm just some kind of some kind of servant. I'm supposed to write a book report because she wrote a sentence. And so the proof that, that speaking to someone communicates more is how much more you get when you're talking to somebody. Right, Em? Really? Little pity party? Disassociation? Okay. I said when we talk, you get so much more out of the conversation, right? That's the proof that there's nuance you lose in a text message. That's the proof. It might not be 80%, but it's something. You'll lose something. And so anyway, I just, for whatever reason, I decided to go over this with you guys in some detail. Not for whatever reasons, because my old friend walked in the room after a month of Sundays. And so a month of Sundays isn't that long. It's 6 months. Sundays happen once a week. And so a month of Sundays is 30 weeks, which is just over 6 months. It's like, I haven't seen you in a month of Sundays. It's like, what you're really saying is, I haven't seen you in, half a year. We think about it, it's like many moons. It's been like years and years, but it doesn't actually mean that. Anyway, here's Prabhupada's translation. One who works in devotion. Where is that coming from? Yoga yukta, one who's yoked to yoga. Because Krishna later on will say that of all yogis, the one who loves me and serves me with great faith and worships me is the greatest yogi. So although Prabhupada's obviously throwing a little bhakti flavor on the verse, Krishna's just about to get there himself and say of all the yogis, the bhakta is the best. We're less than 60 verses away from that. So it's not inappropriate for Prabhupada to throw that in there. I think we're at 62 verses away. We're about 60 verses away. One who works in devotion, who is a pure soul. There's your Vishuddhatma. Who controls his mind and senses. See how Prabhupada did that one? See how smooth that was? I spent so much time on Vijitatma and Jitendriya, right? Jitatma, Jitendriya. Same, right? Who controls his mind and senses. See how smooth that was? That's a translator. You figure out how to render it into a language so people can easily understand what you're talking about. One who works in devotion, who's a pure soul, and who controls his mind and senses, that person is dear to everyone. And everyone is dear to him. See what he did there? He just decided, you know what? This sarva bhutatma means that one self is considered as all selves, and it's this categorical imperative. And so I'm going to say he's dear to everyone, and everyone's dear to him. It's not an inappropriate way of rendering it. It's totally non-literal. But it communicates the same point. It communicates the same point. Though always working, api kurvan, though working, such a man's never entangled. Na lipyate. He's not smeared. He's not defiled. He's not tainted. But what does it mean to be smeared or defiled or tainted in the context of working? It means you get entangled in karma. And therefore Prabhupada picked an appropriate word to communicate the feeling of what was communicated. Lip means to smear. Lipyate is in a verb. It's in the third person present tense singular. He is smeared. And so Prabhupada, he's not entangled. Which really is what the word means in this context. Because how do you get smeared in relationship to work? It's not like if you're working in an oil field and you get smeared, the assumption is you got oil on you. You know what I mean? Or if you're a paramedic and you get smeared, it's like feces or blood or whatever it might be, right? But in the context of working and getting a reaction to that work and becoming bound to this world, then the word entangled is wholly appropriate and it's actually a better translation than a literal one. A literal one could leave somebody a little vexed trying to fill in the blanks. Proper translation is actually better than a literal one. I don't know why we did this. I just looked at the verse and got inspired. I do know why. I got inspired by you walking in late. But there it is. So now we looked at that verse in detail, and you can see where Prabhupada's translation is coming from, how he goes in order and translates all the different ideas. But Prabhupada, was not a literalist. He was not shy about... There are better literal translations of the Gita. But Prabhupada, he gave a faithful translation. When Prabhupada said the Bhagavad Gita as it is, he didn't mean literal. He meant conveying the meaning that was intended to be conveyed by Krishna, conveying the bhakti meaning, the teachings of bhakti, the teachings of devotion, the teachings of love, devotional theism, devotional yoga. He meant that he was preserving that meaning, which most linguists somehow screwed out of the text, twisted out of the text, because Neo-Vedanta and impersonalism was in vogue for the last century or so, when almost all the translations were done in English. So everybody just skewed the meaning and just made it more impersonal than it actually is. And so Prabhupada restored the bhakti to the Gita, a term which occurs scores of times throughout the text, and is the highlight of every chapter. Discussion? Give me a second, Ian. When I used to go out in the beginning of my spiritual life, when I joined the temple, as a young man, as an 18-year-old, they would send me to the airport every day to sell books to people. And I would go out with my, my Shiksha Guru would be the appropriate term, but he was also a friend, and he was also my drill sergeant, and he was also, his name was Vijay Prabhu, which also means to conquer. Vijit, Vijay, they mean the same thing. Jai means to conquer, just like Jit means to conquer. So Vijay Das. We would pick a verse that we liked from the Gita, and then when we approached someone and we spoke to them, when we opened the book up, we'd open the book up to a page that we liked. And then we would go over that verse to the person and try to convince them to purchase the book or give us a donation for the book. This is the verse that Vijay would go to. Now, Vijay was the most successful book distributor in North America for over 20 years. And on average, he would sell 20 Gitas 6 days a week. So let's say 120 books a week. And he would go out 45 to 50 weeks a year. So he would sell, 5,000, 6,000 books a year. Then he would get riled up during the Christmas marathon, during the Christmas season, from Thanksgiving until usually New Year's, in Hare Krishna temples around the world traditionally. Everything would stop, and everybody would go out every single day to distribute books. And if it was your primary service, you would double the amount of time you went out. So instead of going out for 3 or 4 hours, you would go out for 6 or 8 hours. Everybody in our community would do it. People who never went out to distribute books would go out. They would make lunches for us, like really nice lunches. They would deliver lunches like avocado salad sandwiches and stuff like that. They would have big feasts for us. They were totally supportive. They would make jackets and give them to us like as rewards after the whole thing was over. They'd have a big lunch to celebrate. They'd give out awards. They would make a tape with rock and roll songs with Hare Krishna lyrics. Some of the cheesiest stuff ever. It's like basically our version of Christian rock and roll. However, these songs that they would be on these albums, I know the words of by heart, and they're very dear to me. And some of them were like just so corny. Anyway, I'm thinking about whether I should quote some of the lyrics to you. I'm not going to. But, they would do like All Along the Watchtower with Hare Krishna lyrics. That kind of just really, really cheesy stuff. But there were some songs that got produced during that time period which were just super beautiful. There's a song Nirantar sang called Lord Chaitanya's Calling. Lord Chaitanya's calling, please chant the holy name. And if you chant the holy name, your life will never be the same. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. So I walked for several months through the Himalayas in my late teens. And when I entered the holy place that we were going to, of Badrinath, by foot, after months of walking, I heard that song in my head. Like it just like naturally, spontaneously came to me. I told Nirantar Prabhu when I saw him later on, that was like somehow or other, that song was so etched into my mind and heart that it's the song that came to me. Like at this really special moment in my life. Anyway, the whole world would change for our temple. And hundreds of devotees at a big temple like Los Angeles. And they were just, people who work jobs would after work go and distribute books or find some way to come out and encourage us and give us a pat on the back. And they make buttons for us, they make jackets for us, they make hats for us. And it was just like a very supportive. And then I would usually time my trip to India, so I got back the day before Thanksgiving because I was really attached to Thanksgiving food. So I'd always want to be back in the U.S. because you're not going to get any kind of Thanksgiving food in India. So I want to get back to the U.S. so I could eat the Thanksgiving meal with the devotees and then be here for the Christmas marathon. So I would go for Kartik to India, and I would make sure I got back. I booked my tickets so I got back the day before Thanksgiving, and then you start the marathon. So Vijay would triple his book distribution during that time. So my guess would be he probably distributed 7,000 Bhagavad Gitas a year, probably in total for about 30 years. I think he's slowed down. He still distributes books every day. So really he's been doing it for 50 years now, since 1978. 42 years. So it sounds to me like he distributed somewhere around 250,000 Gitas. And he would read this verse to everybody. And he was like nobody. He'd approach somebody and they'd take a book every time and give him a huge donation. And he was incredibly empowered. Like nobody else in the world, really. The only person who's empowered like Vijay Prabhu, there's only like one person from the U.S. There's some European distributors who are just out of this world, but there's really only one person in the U.S. who's empowered like Vijay Prabhu and had the same longevity, and that's Vaisheshika Maharaj. They're like the only two people on the planet. A lot of people were big for a minute, but then they faded out. But the two of them have lasted for 40, 50 years. So this verse, one who works in devotion, who's a pure soul, who controls his mind and senses, is dear to everyone, and everyone is dear to him. Though always working, such a man's never entangled. And Vijay would just read, just say this to strangers, and they'd be like, wow, that's a cool verse. Yeah, okay, I'll take the book. It's a beautiful translation of a beautiful verse. Prabhupada's translation skills are on full display. It's special. And really, we've been comparing yoga to sannyas. And Prabhupada's been Krishna's been glorifying yoga as including sannyas, but going beyond. And this verse it's Krishna articulating why yoga is categorically superior to sannyas. There's a compassion element to it. There's a sense of helping other people. It's got all the restraint of sannyas and all the activity of an activist, perfectly married together in a powerful formula. And so there's a certain compassion. The Buddhists have this problem. The Bodhisattva is really a Mahayana or Vajrayana. It's a later Buddhist term, which is representative of the period of time when Buddhism connected with Hinduism. And instead of trying to differentiate itself from Hinduism, it came back and commingled with Hinduism. And you started getting Buddhist deities and what have you, and they got involved in Tantra and all sorts of other stuff, and they went up in the mountains and eventually worked their way over into China. They also had gone this way through Southeast Asia, and they worked their way over into China from the southern side. But they also went through the northern path, through Nepal. That's why you have Tibet. That's why you have all those Tibetan Buddhists. They're coming up through India into that area. And they're passing through, And if you look at people in those areas, they look Chinese, they look Indian. It's a mountain people. They're short, they're stout. It's mountain people. And they look the same on either side of the border. Prior to the Bodhisattva, the enlightened Buddhist, there was the Arhat. That's in Buddha's own language. The Arhat is the term that Buddha used to refer to someone who had become self-realized. And Buddha refused to discuss what happens when the Arhat dies. Does he disintegrate or does he continue? But the idea that the goal was to become callous towards everybody and just bail, it became antithetical enough for the later Buddhists in the Yogacara and the Mahayana tradition, then the Vajrayana tradition, that they started to postulate that there was this Bodhisattva who would stay in this world and enlighten others. And this is really like what the Dalai Lama is. It's a kind of a variant of that. And so they would stay in this world and enlighten others and be able to give light to others. And then once everybody had reached nirvana, then they would extinguish themselves. And that was because compassion dies with impersonalism. To feel compassion is to buy into the illusion that I am me and you are you. And so if you overcome that illusion, then you overcome compassion. And you no longer feel compassion for anybody. Check the time. And so it chafes. And so they had to work into their theology at a later date this idea of a compassionate impersonalist, a compassionate voidist, a compassionate spiritual nihilist. And what you find in this verse is this yogi there is, through a careful looking at the sarvabhutatma bhutatma, that person for whom one being is all beings, and themselves as all beings, you start to see in that a basis for spiritual compassion. And Prabhupada, really fleshes it out. Prabhupada's shameless. One who works in devotion is dear to everyone and everyone is dear to him. And so there's that devotional flavor, but honestly, it's there in the text. It's there in this section. That's what differentiates the yogi from the sannyasi. And so it's a faithful rendering of this idea, and it really is a cap on the whole section we've been studying. Okay, thank you very much, IGTV. We'll go over to Zoom now. We'll get Ian.